They seized every weapon. She forged knives, bows, and a kill zone in the woods. The drone hovered outside my kitchen window for exactly 4 seconds, before the suction's arm extended and pulled my bread knife through the glass like it was made of air. I did not scream. I did not reach for the phone. I stood there with flour on my hands and watched a machine the size of a dinner plate carry away the last sharp thing in my house. And I thought about the creek behind the property, where the riverbed was full of flat gray flint. That was how it started for me. Not with fire in the sky or a message from the president. Not with any of the dramatic things people had expected for 100 years. It started with a drone and a bread knife and a thought about rocks. My name is Mara Voss. I am 34 years old. I grew up in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana, between mountains that do not care whether you are prepared or not. My father taught me to field dress a deer before I could ride a bicycle. My mother taught me to read a creek bed the way other mothers teach their daughters to read music. For the last 9 years, before everything changed, I ran wilderness survival courses for groups of adults who had forgotten that the world existed before electricity. I taught them to make fire, find water, build shelter, and move through the woods without leaving a trace. I thought I was teaching a hobby. I did not know I was teaching a resistance. The Vorkai Collective arrived on a Wednesday morning in early October. Every radar station on the planet picked them up at the same moment. No warning, no gradual approach, no signal sent ahead. 14 vessels, each one roughly the size of Rhode Island, arranged themselves at equal distances above the equator. They did not land. They just stopped there, blotting out sections of sky like thunderclouds that refused to move. The first broadcast came 6 hours later. Every screen on Earth, every phone, every digital display in every shop window played the same message simultaneously. The voice was flat and pleasant, like a customer service recording, and it spoke in every human language at once, each one perfectly fluent, each one using regional idioms as if the speaker had lived there their whole life. I heard it in American English, which felt like a small insult somehow, as if they had decided to meet us exactly where we were and not an inch further. The message was simple. The Vorkai Collective had been observing humanity for some time. They had concluded that humanity posed a danger to itself and to the broader galactic community. The danger was not our technology, our expansion, or our habits as a civilization. The danger, they said, was our weapons. They intended to remove that danger. All weapons would be collected. The process would take 72 hours. Cooperation was expected. Resistance was not recommended. That was it. No list of demands. No discussion of terms, no mention of what would happen after. Just a deadline and a polite suggestion not to push back. My neighbor, Owen Carr, called me within 30 seconds of the broadcast ending. Owen was 61, a retired game warden who had spent 30 years managing wildlife in the Bitterroot, and he was not a man who panicked easily. His voice was tight when he spoke, the kind of tight that comes from pressing fear down into a very small space. "You heard it," he said. It was not a question. "I heard it," I said. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the flour on my hands. "I'm going to finish my bread," I said. "And then I'm going to walk down to the creek." He was quiet for a moment. "The Flint Creek." "The Flint Creek," I said. He hung up without another word, and I knew he understood. The collection process began the following morning. I watched it from the porch with a cup of coffee. The drones came in groups of 3, moving in slow overlapping grids across the valley. They were precise and methodical and almost beautiful in the way they moved. The way a murmuration of starlings is beautiful. That same sense of individual parts obeying a single mind. They scanned through walls. I do not know exactly how, but I could see the faint blue pulse of light moving across the side of my house. And by the time it had passed, the kitchen drawer where I kept my knives was empty. And so was the gun cabinet in the hallway where my father's old hunting rifle had lived since the day he gave it to me. I felt the loss of that rifle the way you feel the loss of a limb, not with pain exactly, but with a wrong kind of emptiness, a silence where something heavy used to live. My father had carried that rifle for 30 years. It smelled like oil and pine resin and the specific cold of November mornings. I had not fired it in 2 years, but knowing it was there had always felt like a hand on my shoulder. Now the cabinet was open and empty, and a drone the size of a dinner plate was already half a mile down the road. The people of the valley handled it in different ways. Some stood on their porches and watched with blank faces. Some cried. A few tried to hide things, mostly handguns tucked into ceiling panels or buried in the yard in waterproof cases. But the drones found everything. The scanning technology was thorough beyond anything we could have imagined. They were not just reading metal. They were reading density, molecular composition, potential energy. Anything that could function as a tool of harm above a certain threshold was gone within 24 hours. The receipts were perhaps the strangest part. Every household received a printed slip through their mail slot, a neat white card listing every item removed, its estimated value, and a reference number for future compensation. It was an administrative act, utterly bloodless, the kind of thing a government sends you when they repossess a vehicle. I lined mine up on the kitchen table and read through it carefully. Hunting rifle listed. Kitchen knives listed. A camp axe I had forgotten was in the shed listed. I read through it twice. Then I read it a third time more slowly, looking for something specific. There was no entry for stone, no entry for wood, no entry for bone, no entry for plant fibers or animal sinew or any of the 100 materials that human beings used to shape the world for 10,000 years before the first iron forge ever burned. I turned the receipt over. The back was blank. I put on my boots and walked down to the creek. The flint was exactly where it had always been, gray and flat and patient, sitting in the water the way it had been sitting in that water for roughly 40 million years. I crouched down and picked up a piece the size of my palm, turned it in my hands, felt the edges. It was good stone, dense and fine-grained, the kind that flakes clean when you know what you are doing. I had not knapped flint since a workshop I attended 12 years ago during my first year of teaching survival courses. But the knowledge was still there, sitting at the back of my hands rather than the front of my mind, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the brain. I found a hammerstone nearby, a rounded quartzite cobble, and I sat down in the shallow water with my jeans getting wet and I began to work. The first chip came off clean, then another. I worked slowly, shaping the edge, removing flakes in careful, deliberate sequences. The sound was crisp and flat, like a small knock on a wooden door, and with each strike the stone became less like a rock and more like a thing with purpose. An hour later, I had a blade roughly the length of my hand, sharp enough to shave the fine hairs from my forearm. It was not beautiful. It was not balanced. It was nothing like the tools I had seen in the glass cases at natural history museums, the ones shaped by hands that had done this 10,000 times. But it was mine, and no drone had scanned for it, and no receipt would ever list it, because the Vorkai had looked at humanity and seen only the weapons we had made in the last 300 years. They had not thought to look at the other 10,000. I stood up from the creek, wet to the knee, and held the blade in the late afternoon light. Somewhere above me, invisible in the high cold blue of the sky, 14 ships the size of small states held their positions and congratulated themselves on having solved the problem of human violence. I thought about the yew trees on the south slope of the ridge. I thought about the stands of ash and the dogbane plants along the fence line whose stems, dried and twisted, made some of the strongest natural cord I had ever worked with. I thought about Owen, and about a girl named Wren, who was 17 years old, and had been coming to my courses since she was 12, and could move through dense timber, faster and quieter than anyone I had ever trained. I thought about a quiet man named Desh Farrow, who drove out from Missoula twice a month to attend my blacksmithing hobbyist group, and who had once on a long afternoon rebuilt a medieval crossbow from memory just to see if he still could. I looked at the blade in my hand. I looked at the mountains. The Vorkai had come to disarm us. They had done a thorough job by every measure they understood to apply. In 3 days, every manufactured weapon on Earth had been catalogued, collected and removed, without a single act of force, without a single human life lost, without a single raised voice on either side. It was, by their accounting, a complete success. They had made one mistake. It was not a small one. They had assumed that a species which had spent 10,000 years learning to survive with its bare hands could be rendered helpless by taking away what those hands had learned to build in the most recent 300. They had taken the metal and left the memory. They had taken the guns and left the stone. They had taken the knives and left the trees and the creek beds and the long, unbroken chain of human knowledge that runs from the first sharp rock to every survival course I had ever taught. I slid the flint blade into my pocket and walked back up the hill toward the house, already thinking about what I would need to cut first. I do not remember sleeping much in the days that followed the collection. There was too much to do, and the part of my brain that usually handled sleep had apparently decided it was needed elsewhere. The valley looked wrong in those first weeks. Not physically. The mountains were the same. The creek was the same. The morning light still came over the eastern ridge in that specific gold that made even November feel like something worth seeing. But the people moved differently. There was a new kind of quietness to everything. The quietness of people who have had something taken and are not sure yet how to name what is missing. Neighbors who had always waved from their trucks now stopped and talked for long stretches. There was a lot of standing in driveways, a lot of staring at the sky. People were doing math in their heads, running the same calculation over and over, trying to work out what exactly the Vorkai wanted, and what exactly they were willing to give in return for a disarmed planet. No one came up with a satisfying answer, because the Vorkai did not say. Their ships sat in the sky, their drones continued their slow, overlapping grid patrols, still scanning, still watching. Occasionally a new broadcast would play on every screen, a brief update of cheerful, meaningless reassurance. The Vorkai Collective was pleased with humanity's cooperation. Resources were being assessed. A plan for mutual benefit was being developed. Please continue your daily activities. Please continue your daily activities. I heard that phrase so often in those early weeks that it started to sound like a threat. I did not continue my daily activities. I loaded 3 backpacks with the things that drones would not flag: fire-starting materials, dried food, basic medical supplies, maps printed on paper rather than stored on any device, and I walked into the National Forest on a gray November morning with Owen Carr on my left, and Ren Oakley on my right, and Desh Farrow behind us carrying a pack that clinked softly with the sound of various stones he had been collecting since the day the collection happened. Ren had shown up at my door the evening before without being asked. She stood on the porch in her hunting jacket, her dark hair pulled back, her pack already on her shoulders, and she looked at me with that particular expression she had, the one that was not quite patience and not quite urgency, but somewhere between the two, and she said, "I figured we were going." "We're going," I said. "Good," she said. "I brought dogenbane from my mother's fence line, 3 pounds. Already dried." I looked at her for a moment. She was 17 years old, and she had already done the same calculation I had done standing in the creek, and she had arrived at the same answer, and she had come prepared. I thought about what kind of world turns a 17-year-old into that, and then I stopped thinking about it, because there was no useful direction that thought could go. Desh Farrow I had called directly. He had answered on the first ring and said, "I was waiting for you to call," and I could hear in his voice that he had been sitting with his boots on, packed beside the door, the same way a person waits for a train they are certain is coming. The 4 of us moved into the forest in single file, following a game trail I had used for years, the kind of trail that does not appear on any map and does not have a name except the one a person gives it in their own head. I called it the long way in. It wound through old-growth timber, across a shallow river crossing, up a switchback of loose shale, and into a hidden basin on the north face of a ridge that I had used as a base camp during teaching exercises for 6 years. No road reached it. No snowmobile trail came close. A drone flying a standard grid pattern would cross directly above it, because from above it looked like nothing more than a dense cluster of spruce and fir, with a flat patch of ground at its center. That flat patch of ground was where we set up camp on our first night. The fire was small and deep, set inside a Dakota hole I dug in less than an hour. 2 connected chambers angled so that the second chamber drew air up through the first, feeding the flame with almost no visible smoke. I had taught that technique to probably 300 people over the years. Every one of them had been amazed by it. It felt good to use it now for something real. We did not talk much that first night. We ate, we planned in broad strokes, and we slept in shifts. By the time gray light came through the trees the next morning, we had agreed on the basics. The basin would be our workshop. We would build tools and test them. We would rotate in and out of the valley in small groups to collect materials and gauge the Vorkai's movements. We would not act until we understood what we were working with on both sides. The first workshop session began that same morning, and it began with flint. I set out the stones I had collected from the creek and the shale slope, arranged by type: dark gray chert, tan quartzite, a few pieces of actual obsidian I had carried in from a cache I kept in the workshop shed at my property, and several pieces of the fine-grained local flint that I already knew would work well. I laid out the hammerstones beside them, selected for size and density, and I sat down cross-legged in the cold morning air and began to work. Owen watched from the left, arms folded, saying nothing. Ren crouched on my right, her eyes moving between my hands and the stone, cataloging every movement. Desh sat directly across from me with his elbows on his knees, and a look of intense concentration on his face that I had only seen on him before when he was diagnosing a problem with a piece of ironwork. The first blade took me 40 minutes. It was better than the one I had made in the creek, longer and with a more consistent edge, the kind of blade that would hold up to real work. When I set it down in front of them, Ren picked it up immediately, tested the edge against her thumbnail, and nodded once with the precise economy of someone who has evaluated a great many things. Show me, she said. I spent the next 2 hours teaching all three of them the basics of flint knapping. Desh caught on fastest, which did not surprise me. His hands knew how to listen to stone and metal in a way that most hands do not. By the end of the first session, he was producing usable flakes that, while not yet finished tools, were sharper than anything a kitchen drawer had held before the collection. Owen worked more slowly and with great care, producing fewer pieces but with better geometry. Ren broke 3 stones before something clicked in her approach, and after that she was relentless, producing blade after blade with the same single-mindedness she brought to everything. By the end of the first week we had 22 blades of varying sizes, 11 scrapers, and 6 points suitable for use as arrowheads. We had also begun work on the bows. The yew I had thought about on the day I stood in the creek came from a stand on the south slope of the ridge, exactly where I remembered it. Yew is the traditional wood of the English longbow, famously dense and flexible in its combination of heartwood and sapwood. But in our location and our time frame I was working with what was available. And what was available was ash. The ash trees along the creek valley were straight-grained and consistent, and once I had selected the right stave from a felled tree, growth rings close together, no knots in the critical section, roughly my own height and length, the work went smoothly. I shaped the stave with stone scrapers over 3 days, removing material slowly and testing the bend constantly, watching for the specific arc that tells you a bow is sharing its work evenly across the full length of the limbs. Ren sat beside me for most of those 3 days, at first watching and then working her own stave, and she asked the right questions. The kind of questions that come from someone genuinely trying to understand the principle, rather than just copy the motion. Why do you keep bending it? She asked on the second afternoon. Because wood remembers stress, I told her. If I bend it and it takes the curve evenly all the way to the tips, it's good. If one spot bends more than the rest, that spot is going to break. The goal is to spread the work across the whole thing, not pile it on one point. She thought about that for a moment. That's not just about bows, she said. No, I said, it's not. The strings came from the dogbane she had brought. Dried dogbane stalks, when retted and split and twisted, produce a fiber that is genuinely impressive in its tensile strength, finer and stronger than most natural cordage options available in temperate North America. Ren had processed hers well, the strands were clean and consistent, and when she twisted them into a bowstring, using the reverse wrap technique I showed her, the resulting cord held its first test pull without a single fiber breaking. We strung the first completed bow on the 9th day in the basin. It was not a beautiful piece of work. The limbs were slightly uneven, and the handle section was thicker than ideal. But when I drew it back to anchor point and released a dry fire test without an arrow, the snap and surge of stored energy that passed through the limbs into my palm was real and solid and completely invisible to every scanner and every drone that had been flying overhead since October. I held the bow for a moment and listened to the sound of the forest around us. Wind in the high spruce, a raven somewhere on the ridge, somewhere above the cloud layer, the faint deep tone of a Vorkai vessel maintaining its position. I handed the bow to Ren. She drew it once, tested the feel at anchor, and lowered it. How long before we can shoot, she asked. The arrows take another 2 days, I said. Fletching from turkey feathers, shafts from straight-grained willow, points from the flint we knapped. 2 days, she said. She looked at the bow in her hands. How many do we make? As many as we can, I said. And then we make more. Desh came to crouch beside us, his hands already working a new piece of flint, turning it slowly against a hammerstone. I've been thinking about something, he said. Tell me, I said. The drones, he said. They do thermal scans, they can see heat signatures. But the thermal scan only flags things that match specific profiles, movement patterns, heat output above a threshold. He paused. What if we could give them something to look at instead? Something warm and consistent, in a place we're not. I looked at him. A decoy. A fire, he said, specifically designed to mimic the heat output of a small group of people, small and steady. Far enough from here that a drone following the signal would commit to the trajectory before it could correct. Owen, who had been listening from his seat against a tree trunk, spoke for the first time in several hours. You'd need it to last. A real fire goes up and down. The signature would have to be consistent. Hardwood coals, Desh said. Deep pit. Low airflow. A coal bed that radiates rather than flames. It runs for hours with no visible smoke. A steady flat thermal output. He looked at me. Could work. It could work, I said. We test it next week. It was not glory what we were building. It did not feel like the beginning of anything cinematic or grand. It felt like work, slow and cold and methodical. The kind of work that asks everything of your hands and your patience, and gives back very little in the short term. There were mornings when I woke up stiff and sore on the frozen ground and lay there for a moment staring at the canopy and thought about the warmth of my kitchen and the simple normality of a life that had existed 3 weeks ago. Then I got up and went back to work. Wren never lingered in her sleeping bag. Every morning she was up before the light had fully settled, already moving, already reaching for the nearest task. There was something in her that the situation had ignited, a quality of focus and purpose that, in normal times, would have made her an extraordinary athlete or engineer or soldier. In these times, it made her the most important person I had in that camp. She was still 17, I never forgot that. And on the nights when she sat by the small fire and sharpened a stone blade with patient, even strokes, her face calm and her eyes distant, I wished with a specific and helpless feeling that she was somewhere safe, somewhere that had no use for the things I was teaching her. But the Vorkai had decided there was no such place, and I was a survival instructor who had spent 9 years believing that preparation is never wasted. So I taught her to make arrows, and she learned so fast it almost frightened me. By the end of the second week, we had 4 working bows and enough arrows to arm each of us properly. The flint points were seated and lashed with wet sinew that had dried tight as wire. The shafts were straight and consistent, cut from willow with stone scrapers, and smoothed over 3 evenings of careful work. The fletching came from turkey feathers I had collected from a roost site half a mile from the basin. The feathers split and bound with more sinew, set at the correct helical angle to stabilize the arrow in flight. On the 14th morning, Wren walked 30 paces from camp, drew, and put 3 arrows into a paper target I had tacked to a spruce trunk, all 3 inside a circle I could cover with my palm. She lowered the bow and turned to look at me, and she did not smile, exactly, but there was something in her expression that was close to it. Not pleasure, readiness. I stood there in the cold, in the quiet of the forest, with the distant hum of a drone somewhere to the south running its grid, and I thought, they took everything they recognized as dangerous. They had no idea what they left behind. The kill zone did not begin as a plan, it began as a map. I had kept maps of the Bitterroot and the surrounding national forest for years, the kind of detailed, hand-annotated maps that accumulate from a decade of walking the same ground over and over with different eyes each season. Contour lines in pencil, water sources in blue, game trails in faded red marker, notes in the margins about deadfall risk after the big wind years and which creek crossings ran fast in spring and which were reliable all year. These maps lived in a waterproof tube in my pack, and when I spread them out on the flat stone we used as a table in the basin, they told a story that I was only beginning to understand as a story about control. The Vorkai patrol routes had become predictable by the 3rd week. Predictable was the wrong word, actually. Predictable implies they were trying to be varied and failing. The truth was they were not trying to be varied at all. Their ground units, when they appeared, followed the valley roads. They did not deviate. They did not range into rough terrain. They were heavy, armored, and deliberate, and they moved with the assumption that the ground belonged to them and that nothing on it could present them with a serious problem. That assumption was their architecture, and architecture has weak points. I spent 3 days walking the terrain between our basin and the nearest Vorkai patrol corridor without going close enough to the road to be scanned. I walked it in the early morning when the light was low, and I could see the shadows of the land clearly, and I walked it in the evening when the temperature dropped and the forest settled into silence. I studied every rise and fall of the ground, every channel that a patrol would have to cross, every natural funnel between ridges where movement was constrained by geography. There was one section, about 2 miles from the basin and half a mile from the road, where the terrain made a decision for anyone moving through it. A shallow ravine ran between 2 parallel ridges, and the only practical way through was along the ravine bottom, where the ground was firm and the overhead canopy was dense. The ravine was roughly 60 meters long and 12 meters wide at its narrowest point. The walls were steep on both sides, loose shale over clay, not easily climbed quickly. At the eastern end, a standing crop of old spruce provided natural cover from above. It was, in the language of military terrain assessment, a natural kill ground. I had walked past it a dozen times over the years, without thinking of it in those terms, because there had been no reason to. Now I stood at its western entrance for a long time, looking at the angles, feeling the way the wind moved through it, and I began to think about what could be built in a place like this by 4 people with stone tools, 6 weeks of preparation, and a thorough knowledge of what physics and gravity will do to a load-bearing system when the support is removed. I brought everyone back the next morning. We stood at the eastern end of the ravine in the pale light, and I walked them through what I was seeing. Owen listened with his arms folded, and his eyes moving over the terrain in the way that a man who spent 30 years tracking wildlife across complex ground learns to read it, in layers and angles and probabilities. Desh crouched on the slope and dug his fingers into the shale, testing its stability, weighing things in his mind that I could not quite follow, but knew were structural. Ren stood at the narrowest point and turned slowly, measuring distances with her eyes. Deadfall, Owen said after a while. Deadfall, I agreed. The principle of a deadfall trap is ancient and elegant. A weight is suspended above a space and held in place by a trigger system. When the trigger is disturbed, the weight falls. We were going to scale this principle to dimensions that the Vorkai, for all their technology, had clearly never needed to plan for, because they had never before encountered a species that met disarmament by remembering it knew how to build things from trees. We spent the first 3 days in the ravine doing nothing but moving timber. There was no shortage of fallen wood in the old-growth forest around us. Trees that had come down in wind events over the past decade, trunks 3 and 4 feet in diameter. Their root systems already decayed enough to allow repositioning with the right leverage. We cut rope from braided plant fiber, using dogbane and nettle cordage twisted to thicknesses that Owen tested by hanging from until his feet left the ground. We cut props from green hardwood, shaped into precise dimensions with our stone blades. The trigger arms carved with notches that would hold under load and release cleanly under the right force. Desh engineered the counterweight systems. He had a mind that worked in forces and vectors, and he approached the problem of a suspended log the way he approached a piece of ironwork, as a conversation between materials and gravity. He calculated angles of support, estimated the mass of each timber, worked out the minimum trigger sensitivity needed to ensure that a unit walking through would disturb the system reliably without requiring a direct strike. He carved small-scale models in green wood and tested them with pebbles before approving each full-scale version. It was extraordinary to watch. There was no computer modeling, no engineering software, no precision measuring tools. There was a man sitting in a cold ravine with a stone blade and a handful of sticks and 40 years of accumulated mechanical intuition, building physics from scratch. By the end of the first week in the ravine, the western entrance held the first trigger system, buried under a thin layer of compressed leaf litter and forest debris, the cordage leading up and over a bent sapling to a counterweight log, suspended 8 feet above the path. A unit walking through at standard pace would have the log across its path within 1 second of triggering. We placed 4 more systems along the 60-meter length of the ravine. Each one was independent, triggered by different mechanisms: a pressure plate of bark over a shallow void, a tripwire of dark sinew strung at ankle height, a tension release connected to a carved wooden pin that would shear under lateral force. No two were identical. No two could be defeated by the same countermove. The elevated ambush positions came next. On both walls of the ravine, where the shale gave way to firmer ground above the lip, we built platforms from lashed timber braced against the standing trees. The platforms were not large, 2 by 3 meters, enough for one person to lie flat and hold a drawn bow with clear sight lines down into the ravine. We built 6 of them over 2 weeks. Each one approached from above through the forest so that no traffic pattern to the ravine walls was established. Along the floor, Ren designed the approach routes herself. She spent an afternoon walking every possible line from the basin to each platform and back, identifying which routes were most concealed from above and which could be moved at speed if a retreat became necessary. She mapped the routes in her own notations on a piece of bark, a system of marks she invented herself that I could not have decoded but that she could read at a run in low light. When she showed me the system, I told her it was good work. "It's just paths," she said. "It's the difference between paths that keep you alive and paths that don't," I said. "That's not a small thing." She looked at me for a moment with that expression that was not quite a smile. "Will it work?" she asked. "Not about the paths, about all of it." I told her the truth. "I don't know. It depends on how they respond, but right now they think this ground is empty. They think there is nothing here that can hurt them. And they think that because they've only been checking for things they already know about. And they don't know about this," she said, looking at the ravine below us, at the suspended timbers and the concealed trigger lines, and the platform braces set into the cliff face above the path. "They've never needed to," I said. "No species they've ever disarmed remembered how to do this." She was quiet for a moment. A raven crossed overhead, riding the updraft from the ridge, and we both watched it go. "Then they picked the wrong species," she said. The thermal decoy system that Desh had proposed was tested and refined during the same period. We built 3 of them at varying distances from the basin, each one a deep-dug coal pit lined with flat stones to concentrate radiated heat, fed with dense hardwood coals that would burn slow, and even for 8 hours with no visible smoke. A drone flying its grid would register each pit as a small human-scale heat source. From above, the pattern of 3 decoys described the heat signature of a resting camp. They were placed at the maximum range at which a drone would redirect to investigate before its internal logic committed it to a new heading. The first time we ran the test, a drone actually altered its course. I watched it from the ridge above the basin, tracking its movement through a break in the canopy. It was heading northeast, straight and steady on its grid, and then it curved, very slightly, toward the eastern decoy pit. It held that heading for about 2 minutes, then resumed its original course when the thermal signature did not resolve into anything actionable. Desh, standing beside me, let out a slow breath. "It worked," he said. "It worked once," I said. "Keep working on it." The arrows accumulated. Ren was producing 8 per day by this point, consistent and well-made, and she had begun teaching Owen the fletching process in the evenings, multiplying our output. We were not yet a fighting force by any conventional measure. We were 4 people in a forest with stone tools and wooden weapons, and a ravine we had spent 3 weeks turning into the most dangerous 60 meters of terrain in the Bitterroot Valley. But the Vorkai did not know the ravine existed. They did not know the platforms existed. They did not know about the trigger systems or the cordage or the coal pits or the 17 years of accumulated knowledge that had gone into every decision made in that forest. They thought the problem was solved. They thought the math was finished. A disarmed humanity was a safe humanity, and a safe humanity was a manageable one, and a manageable humanity would produce resources and cooperation, and a tidy entry in the collective's ledger of successfully pacified species. I stood on the ridge in the late afternoon cold with the bow on my back and the flint blade on my hip and the map of the ravine in my head, and I thought about the gap between what the Vorkai believed and what was true. That gap was the only weapon I needed. Other people found us the way people have always found each other in difficult country. On foot, by word passed through trusted hands, by reading signs left in specific places for people who knew what to look for. I had not organized a network. There was no network to organize. But I had been teaching survival in this country for 9 years, and the people who attend wilderness survival courses are not a random cross-section of the population. They are the ones who feel, even in comfortable times, that the world might require something more of them than they are currently prepared to give. They prepare not because they are afraid, but because they are paying attention. Those people knew where my base camp was. Some of them had slept there during multi-day exercises, and when the drones came and the knives disappeared, and the broadcast played on every screen, some of them put on their boots and started walking. The first to arrive was a woman named Claire Hartley, 53 years old, a former park ranger who had attended 2 of my courses and gone on to develop her own curriculum in wilderness herbalism and plant-based medicine. She came alone, moving through the timber in full dark, and she arrived in the basin so quietly that Owen, who was on watch, did not register her presence until she stepped into the firelight. She set down her pack and looked around at what we had built. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I brought medicine." The pack held a remarkable assembly of dried plant materials, processed tinctures in sealed glass vials, and a field guide to regional plants annotated so densely in her own handwriting that the original text was almost invisible. She had been preparing since the day of the broadcast, working through her own version of the same calculation I had worked through in the creek. She had concluded, as I had, that what was needed in the forest was not only weapons, but the capacity to sustain people who were going to be here for a long time. She also brought something I had not thought to prepare for: knowledge of natural toxins, not as weapons, she was careful to say, as deterrents. Several regional plants produced alkaloid compounds that, concentrated and applied to the surfaces of traps or to the tips of projectile points, would cause significant neurological disruption in any biological system that encountered them. The Vorkai ground units appeared to have biological components, exposed sensory arrays, environmental sampling ports, membrane-covered apertures that appeared to serve respiratory functions. Claire had been observing the patrol units from a distance for 2 weeks before she came to us. "They breathe," she said. "Whatever they are, they take in the local atmosphere, which means they can be affected by what's in it." Desh looked at her with an expression I had learned to recognize on him. The look of someone integrating new information into an existing framework. "How concentrated?" he asked. "I can get the extraction dense enough to be effective over a dispersal radius of about 3 meters, she said. applied to a surface or suspended in a fine mist from a breakable container. Breakable container, Desh said. He picked up a round river stone from the pile near the fire and turned it in his hands, like something thrown from a platform above a confined channel. That would work, Claire said. I sat with that for a moment. Then I nodded. 2 weeks after Claire arrived, a man named Grant Weller came through the trees from the south. He was 41, former military, broad-shouldered and quiet, with the particular kind of stillness that people carry when they have been in places where stillness was the difference between living and not. He had been to one of my courses 3 years ago and had, in his own time since then, accumulated a range of practical knowledge that complemented ours in ways I could not have designed. He knew terrain extensively. He had spent years in rough ground environments operating in ways that required an intimate understanding of how a landscape could be shaped to serve or defeat the people moving through it. He walked the ravine with me the morning after he arrived and said very little for the first 20 minutes, just moving slowly along the floor and then back along the ridgeline above, his eyes cataloging every element we had built. Then he said, "The western entrance is the weak point. Anything approaching from outside the channel has a sight line to 2 of your trigger positions before it. Enters range. If they send a unit that scouts before it commits, those 2 systems are compromised." He was right. I had known it was the weakest section and had been moving around the problem in my head for days without landing on a clean solution. Grant had walked through it once and named it precisely. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Redundancy," he said, "not in the channel, above it." He pointed to a section of the ridge wall above the western entrance, where a natural overhang cast permanent shadow on the ground below. "You put a system there. It's invisible from the approach angle. Anything that scouts the entrance and decides to come in anyway still walks into it. Anything that decides the entrance is safe and moves in at speed definitely does." We built it the following day. Grant worked with the focused efficiency of a person who had done physically demanding work under time pressure before. No wasted motion, no hesitation at the steps that required height or strength. By evening, the western entrance had a new layer. In those same weeks, more people came. Not many. The forest could not sustain a large group without drawing attention, and I was careful about who I accepted and who I redirected to other networks in other valleys. But each person brought a specific depth of knowledge that we had not had before. A retired teacher named Nell Cooper, who had grown up on a farm in Wales and knew more about bog terrain, natural traps, and the behavior of large animals under stress than anyone I had ever met. A young man named Cole Ashby, 26, whose grandfather had been Lakota, and who had grown up learning traditional skills from an early age. In particular, the construction of composite bows using horn and sinew in a laminated design that produced dramatically more stored energy per unit of draw weight than my simple ash staves. Cole's bows, when he completed the first one, had roughly twice the effective range of anything I had built. And then, on a gray afternoon in late December, 2 people arrived together from a distance that surprised me. A woman named Adeze Eze had come from a region of West Africa, where she had been working with a conservation organization before the collection happened. She had spent years in dense bush environments studying animal behavior and had developed, in that context, a thorough knowledge of large-scale terrain manipulation. The kind of knowledge that comes from watching how herds of large animals can be directed through landscape using nothing more than sound, scent, and the strategic placement of barriers. Beside her was a Mongolian woman she had traveled with for the last 3 weeks, a horsewoman and traditional craftsperson named Tuya, who carried with her a partially completed composite bow that, when she finished it 2 days after arriving, made Cole's bows look modest. I will not pretend that what we were building felt like victory. It felt like preparation, which is a different thing entirely. Victory exists in a moment. Preparation exists in the unglamorous accumulation of readiness, in the cold mornings and the sore hands, and the question of whether what you are doing is enough, which you can never fully answer until it is too late to change anything anyway. But there was something happening in that forest that was larger than tactics. Every person who arrived brought a thread of human knowledge from a different part of the world's 10,000-year archive, and, when those threads came together, they formed something that no single person could have held alone. Adeze's understanding of terrain psychology paired with Grant's structural assessment, and Desh's mechanical engineering and Tuya's weaponcraft, and Claire's chemistry and Ren's relentless, precise execution. The sum was genuinely greater than its parts. One afternoon in January, I was working on the arrow supply near the edge of camp when a Vorkai patrol unit appeared at the southern edge of the tree line below the basin. It was alone, and it moved slowly, one of the smaller scout types we had cataloged, roughly the size of a large horse with 6 articulated limbs and 2 forward-facing sensory arrays that pulsed faintly with a light I associated with active scanning. I did not move. I was in deep shadow behind a screen of spruce branches, and Claire's thermal suppression technique, a specific mixture of wet clay and plant materials applied to the skin and outer clothing, kept my heat, signature below the threshold the drones and ground units used for positive identification. I had been wearing it every day for 2 weeks. It smelled like river mud and cedar, and something faintly medicinal that I had stopped noticing. The unit stood at the tree line for 40 seconds. Its sensory arrays swept the basin in slow arcs. The coal pits at the eastern decoy site were active, and I watched the unit's attention appear to shift toward that direction. A subtle forward lean, the arrays orienting slightly east. Then it turned and moved back into the tree line and was gone. It had been 20 meters from the camp. It had looked directly at the basin for 40 seconds and seen nothing. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Later that evening, after the others had heard what happened and the discussion about adjusting the decoy positions had concluded, Grant came to sit beside me and was quiet for a long time in the way he often was before he said something important. "They sent a scout," he said. "They sent a scout," I said. "That means they know something is happening in this sector. They don't know what, but they're starting to look." "Yes," I said. "So we're running out of preparation time." "Yes," I said again. He nodded slowly. "Then we should be ready to use what we've built." I looked at the fire. I looked at the people around it. Claire cataloging her plant materials. Tuya working a new bowstring. Nell sketching terrain modifications on a piece of bark with charcoal. Ren sharpening a stone blade with her eyes somewhere far away. "There's one more thing I need to tell you all," I said, and everyone looked up. I told them about the captured unit. We had not captured it ourselves. A group operating out of Idaho had managed it. A unit that had separated from its patrol after one of their own trap systems had disabled its communications array. They had contained it using methods I did not need to describe in detail, and they had been sitting with it for 6 days, trying to establish communication. What they had established, slowly, through a process of trial and error using every translation software still running on whatever devices remained functional, was fragmentary but clear enough. The Vorka Collective had pacified 63 species before humanity. Not one of those species, once disarmed, had done what we were doing. Not one of them had retreated into wilderness and begun manufacturing weapons from pre-industrial materials. The concept was apparently so foreign to the Collective's tactical modeling that it had not been included as a contingency at all. Their scanners had not been calibrated for stone and bone and plant fiber because in 63 previous operations, no species had thought to use them. The unit, when it understood that its interlocutors were the people responsible for the activity the Collective could not explain, had been quiet for a long time. Then, in the halting translated output, it had produced a statement that the Idaho group had relayed to us verbatim. "Your kind does not grieve and stop. You grieve and continue. This is not a behavior we have modeled. We do not understand the mechanism." I read those words in the firelight to the group in the basin, and there was a long silence after. Then Ren said quietly, "Tell them the mechanism is called being human." Nobody laughed, but everyone nodded. And Desh, who almost never said unnecessary things, added, "Tell them also that we are just getting started." The Vorkai had, in its 63 previous operations, encountered species that grieved, species that were angry, species that fought in the first days before the disarmament was complete, and species that submitted and complied and folded their grief inward until it became something small and manageable. But they had not encountered a species that took its grief and its anger and its fear and turned them into a production line of stone blades and wooden bows and a ravine full of things designed to stop something much larger and more armored than the hands that built them. The mechanism they did not understand was 10,000 years of being the most stubborn, most adaptable, most unwilling to accept the situation species this planet had ever produced. It was the mechanism that had gotten us through ice ages and famines and plagues, and every other event that should, by any reasonable calculation, have ended us. We were still here, we were still sharp, and we were ready. The morning we activated the kill zone was the coldest of the winter. I remember that clearly. The temperature had dropped overnight to something well below zero, and the breath of everyone in the basin came out in long white clouds as we moved through the final preparations in the dark before dawn. We had known for 4 days that a Vorkai ground patrol was being staged from the road corridor to the south. Grant had observed the staging area from a ridge position 2 days running and had counted the units. mapped their equipment, and identified the patrol leader by the different configuration of its sensory arrays. 7 ground units, 2 of the heavy armored type and 5 of the scout variety, with air coverage from 2 drones flying offset patterns above the tree line. Their objective appeared to be the eastern section of the forest, where the Idaho group had been operating, but their route would take them through the valley below the ravine. The route had not been a coincidence. We had made it not a coincidence. Over the previous 2 weeks, at Grant's direction, we had laid a sequence of subtle trail signs that a scanning patrol would read as evidence of human activity moving east through the valley. Broken branches at the right height, faint boot impressions in soft ground at creek crossings, a carefully maintained fire scar at a site 2 miles west of the ravine that a thermal scan would identify as a recently used camp. Each sign was placed to draw a patrol from the road toward the east, and each sign was far enough apart that the trail would not look laid but discovered. The patrol took the bait on the morning of the 3rd day after Grant reported its staging. I watched from the ridge as its formation entered the valley below, moving in the staggered pattern their units used in suspected hostile terrain. The 2 heavy units anchored the center. The scouts moved in a wide arc around the flanks. The drone coverage shifted to match the ground formation below, tightening its pattern as the patrol moved deeper into the valley and away from the road. I had 9 people in position, Wren and Cole on the eastern platforms above the ravine, with Cole's composite bows and a full quiver each. Grant and Nell on the western approach, responsible for triggering the entrance system and covering the retreat from above if the patrol attempted to exit the way it came. Desh and Tuya on the southern wall platforms, midway along the ravine, with both bows and a supply of Claire's prepared dispersion vessels. Clay spheres packed with plant compound suspension, designed to break on impact against hard surfaces and disperse their contents in a 3-meter radius. Claire herself was positioned on the northern ridge with a signaling role, watching the drone patterns and signaling their position to the ground teams, using a system of mirror flashes we had tested over 2 weeks until it was reliable to within 1 second of accuracy. Adaze was at the western decoy pits, responsible for keeping their thermal signatures active and stable throughout the engagement. Owen held the northern approach, our rearmost position, watching for any secondary units that might loop around while the primary patrol was committed. I was at the center of the southern wall, above the midpoint of the ravine, with a clear sight line to the full length of the channel below. The patrol reached the ravine entrance at just past 9 in the morning. I watched through a gap in the spruce branches as the lead scout unit paused at the western approach, its sensory arrays sweeping the channel in slow arcs. It was exactly where Grant had predicted it would pause, and it paused for exactly as long as Grant had predicted it would pause. Then it moved forward into the channel. The second scout followed, then the third. The 2 heavy units entered in tandem, their articulated limbs carrying their mass with the slow, certain motion of things that have never been afraid of the ground beneath them. The western entrance trigger released with a sound like a crack of ice, sudden and sharp in the cold air, and the suspended timber came down across the channel behind the last unit to enter, closing the exit. The patrol formation broke. The lead scouts surged forward. One of the rear units turned and drove against the dropped timber, its limbs working against the weight of the log. The heavy units rotated outward, their arrays sweeping the walls. The second system released, then the third, then the fourth, in the middle of the channel, where the 2 heavy units had moved to attempt a flanking assessment of the walls. The load of timber came down at an angle, across the path of the nearer heavy unit, and the impact was significant. From above, from the 6 platform positions, arrows came down into the channel in a pattern we had drilled for 2 weeks, targeting the exposed sensory arrays and the environmental sampling ports that Claire had identified as vulnerable apertures. Tuya's arrows, loosed from a draw weight I could feel in the air even from my position, struck with a force that the lighter units clearly did not expect from what their models presumably described as primitive projectile weapons. Claire's dispersion vessels followed the second volley. Desh and Tuya threw them from the southern wall platforms, aiming for the cluster of units at the channel's center, and they broke against the armored surfaces and the ground and released their contents in a rolling cloud that the wind in the channel carried forward and back across the formation. The effect on the biological components was visible within 30 seconds. The sensory arrays on 3 of the 5 scout units began moving in ways that did not match the formation's actions: erratic sweeps, overcorrections, a loss of synchronization between the unit's visual tracking and its physical movement. One scout walked into the ravine wall. Another stopped and held its position, its arrays cycling in a pattern I had not seen before. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like confusion. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the patrol had not exited the ravine at either end. The drone coverage had been drawn off by the decoy pits 40 minutes before the patrol entered the valley, exactly as designed. Claire had signaled their departure from the operational area with 3 flashes at the 20-minute mark, giving us the window we needed. I climbed down from the platform and walked the length of the channel, checking every position. The others came down from the walls. Nobody spoke for a while. The cold air was very still. Owen arrived from the northern approach and stood at the ravine entrance and looked down its length and said nothing. Grant moved methodically along the channel, assessing every trigger system, noting what had performed as designed and what needed adjustment. Ren was already on the eastern platform, resetting her position for the next use, working with the focused economy that was her characteristic mode. Desh came to stand beside me at the center of the channel. He was covered in the clay and plant compound from Claire's thermal suppression formula, as we all were, and his face was calm in the specific way that follows concentrated physical work. It worked, I said. Most of it worked, he said. The third trigger released half a second late. I want to adjust the notch depth before we use it again. Adjust it, I said. He nodded and walked toward the third system. I stood in the ravine for a moment by myself, above the channel, through the narrow strip of sky visible between the ridge walls. The winter sky was pale gray and empty. Somewhere above that gray, 14 ships held their positions and processed their data and ran their models and tried to understand why a pacified and disarmed species was continuing to present an unmodeled problem. I thought about the unit in Idaho sitting in a cold room somewhere, producing its halting translated outputs. I thought about its statement about grief, about the mechanism it could not model. I thought about Owen's wife, who had been ill before any of this started, and who had been cut off from her medication supply when the Vorkai's resource reallocation began affecting medical distribution. I thought about the game warden who had stood on his porch, watching drones carry away his lifetime collection and said, "The Flint Creek," and understood immediately what I was thinking. I thought about Ren, 17 years old, resetting a platform position in a ravine where 11 minutes ago she had done things that 17-year-olds should not have to do, working with the careful efficiency of someone who has already processed whatever she needs to process and decided that processing it will not change the work that remains. I thought about Desh adjusting the notch depth on the third trigger because a half-second timing error was unacceptable and could be fixed. The Vorkai had sent its 64th pacification operation to a species that had been forging tools since before written language existed. They had removed every weapon they could scan for, confident in the completeness of their inventory, confident in the precedent of 63 previous successes. They had not scanned for stubbornness. They had not scanned for memory. They had not scanned for the specific unquantifiable human quality of looking at a creek full of flint and thinking, "That will do." I pulled my stone blade from the sheath on my hip and turned it in my hands. The edge was still good. 40 million years of patient geology, shaped by a human hand into something the most technologically advanced species in the local galactic community had not thought to plan for. I put it away and climbed out of the ravine and went back to work. The call came out of Idaho by runner, a young man named Pete Sandler, who covered 40 miles of winter terrain in just under 18 hours and arrived at the basin at 3 in the morning with frostbitten cheeks and a folded piece of paper in his inside pocket that he held out to me before he had finished catching his breath. The message was handwritten and brief. The Vorkai had sent a broadcast. It had gone to every screen as all their broadcasts did, but this one was different from every previous transmission in a single specific way. Every other broadcast had been an announcement. This one was a request. They wanted to talk. I stood in the firelight holding the paper and read it 3 times. Then I handed it to Grant, who read it once and handed it back without expression. "First time?" I asked. "First time they've asked," Pete said. He had been given a blanket and a cup of hot water and was sitting close to the fire with the specific gratitude of someone who has been very cold for a very long time. Idaho Group says it's the same on their end. Same broadcast, same language, same channel. They want representatives. They want a location. They want a date. They want conditions, Grant said. They want conditions, I agreed. The fire crackled between us and nobody said anything for a while. Cole was awake, sitting on the far side of the fire with his bow across his knees. Listening, Ren was awake too, which did not surprise me. She was always awake when something important was happening, as if some part of her was permanently on watch even in sleep. "They've never asked before," she said, "not a question." "No," I said. "So something changed." Several things changed, I said. But I think the biggest thing is that they ran their projection models and the models started returning answers they didn't like. Desh, from his sleeping area, spoke without looking up from the knife edge he was sharpening by feel. How long do we wait before we answer? We don't wait, I said. We answer tomorrow. But we answer on our terms, not theirs. The terms I sent back, through the same runner network that had brought the message, were straightforward. The meeting would be on ground we selected, not ground they selected. It would happen in the open, with access to the surrounding terrain for our people, not in any structure or vessel they controlled. Our representatives would arrive and depart as they chose. No scanning equipment within 2 kilometers of the meeting location. And the meeting would begin not with any statement of Vorkai intent, but with an explanation of what they intended to return. The response came back in 30 hours. They accepted all conditions. I did not feel triumph when I read that. I felt the specific, careful alertness of someone who has been in difficult country long enough to know that a clear path can still have a drop at the end of it. I had been teaching people not to celebrate the summit until they were safely off the mountain, for long enough that the habit was bone deep. Grant and I walked the meeting site together 2 days before the scheduled date. It was an open meadow at the edge of the forest, roughly 400 meters across, with good sight lines in all directions and the tree line close enough on 3 sides to make it a comfortable position for archers in concealment. If the Vorkai sent ground units rather than representatives, or if the scanner prohibition was violated, the meadow could become something else very quickly. Grant noted every angle and positioned people accordingly, not telling them they would need to act, but ensuring they would be ready if they did. On the morning of the meeting, I walked out of the tree line into the meadow with Owen beside me and Claire 10 paces behind, and we stood in the cold open air and waited. The Vorkai representative arrived from the north, moving low over the meadow at a height of about 50 meters before descending. It was a vehicle of some kind, small by their standards, no larger than a delivery truck, and it settled onto the frozen grass without sound. A single unit emerged. It was different from the patrol and scout units we had observed. Taller, with sensory arrays that moved with a different quality. Something closer to deliberateness, and a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It stopped 20 meters from us and its arrays oriented toward me, and it spoke in clear American English. "You are Mara Voss," it said. "You have been identified as the primary organizer of resistance activity in this region." "I've been called worse," I said. There was a pause. "We have reviewed the events of the last 3 months," it said. "We find that our initial assessment of the situation on this planet was incomplete." "Tell me what was incomplete about it," I said. Another pause. "We assessed human capacity for organized resistance following comprehensive disarmament. Our model was built on data from 63 previous operations. In each case, once primary weapons were removed, resistance activity ceased within a calculable period due to resource exhaustion and absence of tactical options. And with us," I said. "The model did not account for the persistence of pre-industrial manufacturing capability in a species with your evolutionary history," it said. "We did not consider the depth of retained knowledge regarding non-metallic tools and construction methods. We did not model the network formation behavior demonstrated over the past months. And we did not account for the species-wide motivational profile regarding continued operation under conditions of significant loss." I looked at it for a moment. "You mean you didn't expect us to keep going after people died?" "Correct," it said. "In our previous operations, significant losses consistently produced a disruption in coordinated activity. With your species, the opposite has been observed." "That's because loss doesn't stop us," Owen said from beside me. "It makes us more sure of what we're doing." The unit's arrays moved toward Owen. "This was noted in our analysis," it said. "It is not a characteristic we had previously encountered." I said, "What are you offering?" "A renegotiation of terms," it said. "The collective is prepared to consider a modified arrangement regarding the planet's resources and autonomy, in exchange for a cessation of resistance activity." "A modified arrangement," I said. "Be specific." The unit was specific. Over the next 2 hours, standing in the cold meadow with the wind moving across the frozen grass and the tree line watching from 3 sides, it laid out what the collective was prepared to concede. Withdrawal of resource reallocation processes, restoration of confiscated materials. Not weapons, it was careful to specify, but the equipment, food stores, medical supplies, and other goods that had been absorbed in the months following disarmament. Establishment of a formal communication protocol, through which human representatives and the collective would negotiate rather than the collective simply deciding, And most significantly, a suspension of the weapons prohibition pending a joint assessment process to which human experts would contribute. The suspension of the prohibition. I held that phrase in my head for a moment and felt what it meant, and what it did not yet mean, and how far there still was to go before it meant what it should mean. This isn't a full restoration, I said. Not yet. No, it said. It is a beginning. Then it is a beginning, I said, and will hold you to every word of it. The process of getting there had not been quick or clean. It had been cold and slow and costly in ways that I was still adding up. Owen, at 61, had developed chest infection during the worst of the winter that had taken Claire 2 weeks of intensive botanical treatment to bring under control. And there were nights during those 2 weeks when I had sat beside him in the cold and thought about a world where the medication he needed was still in a supply chain that was still functioning, and I had felt a particular kind of anger that I stored carefully rather than burning through it, because there was work to do and anger spent too quickly does not last. Others had been lost in other ways, in other valleys, in other forests. The networks we had built communicated through runners and signal fires and cached messages, and the messages that came in from other regions over those months were not always good. There were names I now carried the weight of that I had not known 3 months before. People who had built their own ravines in their own forests, and had run their own calculations, and come to their own versions of the same conclusion. I had come to standing in a creek with flour on my hands, and who had paid the cost of acting on that conclusion. I thought about all of them standing in that meadow. I thought about them when the Vorkai unit's vehicle lifted from the frozen grass and moved north across the sky and disappeared. Grant came out of the tree line and stood beside me. He looked at the empty sky for a moment. "One step," he said. "One step," I said. "Do we trust it?" "We trust the leverage," I said. "We verify the actions. We keep building," he nodded. "I'll keep the positions active." "Keep every position active," I said. "Every trap, every decoy, every platform. Nothing changes until the words become deeds." "Understood," he said, and walked back into the trees. Claire came to stand on my other side. She did not say anything for a while. The meadow was empty and cold and very bright in the winter light, and the mountains above the tree line were exactly what they had always been, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the negotiations of small creatures in the valley below. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought about that for a moment, about the flour on my hands in the kitchen, about the drone and the bread knife in the creek full of flint, about 9 years of teaching people that the most important survival skill is not any single technique but the willingness to use whatever the world has left you with. "Like preparation," I said. "Like we've done enough preparation to earn the next step." She thought about that. "And Wren?" I looked toward the tree line where Wren's position was. I could not see her, which meant she was doing her job correctly. She was in there somewhere, still and quiet in the cold, a 17-year-old girl with a composite bow and a full quiver and a mind like a blade, waiting with the patient alertness of someone who has learned, at an age when people should be learning other things. That readiness is not a moment but a permanent state. "Wren is going to be fine," I said. "Wren is going to be more than fine." I said it because I needed it to be true, and I said it because the alternative was a door I could not open and still function. And I said it because in 3 months of the hardest work of my life, I had watched that girl become something extraordinary, something the Vorkai had not scanned for, and had not modeled, and had not found any precedent for in 63 previous operations on 63 previous worlds, and whatever the cost of that had been, there was a version of the future in which it was worth it. The version in which we kept going. The version in which we did not stop. That was the mechanism they could not model. Not any individual act of cleverness or courage. Not the flint napping or the bow making or the ravine. Not the decoy fires or the platform positions or Claire's chemistry or Dash's engineering or Grant's terrain reading. All of those were the expression of it. But the thing itself, the mechanism that had baffled the Vorkai Collective and their 63 species, database and all their predictive models, was simpler and older and more durable than any of it. We did not stop. We did not know how to stop. It was not in us to stop. Not when there was still something that could be built. Not when there was still something that could be sharpened. Not when the creek was still full of flint and the forest was still full of timber, and the hands that had shaped this world once could shape it again. They had come to disarm a species. They had found a species that was, at its deepest level, inarmed. Not armed in the sense of weapons carried, but in the sense of an armedness that lives in the bone and the memory, and the particular human refusal to accept that any situation is final. They took every manufactured weapon we had. They left behind everything else. They would learn, As they continued their negotiations and their revised assessments, and their rethinking of the Voss variable in their predictive models, that everything else was the only thing that had ever mattered. I walked back into the trees to find Wren and tell her what had happened. She was where I expected her to be, in position, bow in hand, watching the meadow with steady eyes. She lowered the bow when she saw me. "Well?" she said. They blinked, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it over?" "No," I said. "It is the beginning of not being over." Which is different. She thought about that in the specific way she thought about things, rolling it over, testing it. Then she nodded once, with the precision that was her characteristic gesture, the nod of someone who has evaluated a situation and found the analysis sound. "Then we keep going," she said. "We keep going," I said. She put the bow over her shoulder and walked back toward camp, and I stood for a moment in the trees and listened to the mountain and thought about the creek and the flower and the flat gray stone that had been sitting in the water for 40 million years, waiting for a hand that knew what to do with it. We had not won, not yet, not fully, but we had done the thing that mattered most, the thing the Vorkai had never encountered in 63 worlds of conquest. We had made them understand that we were not going to stop. And in that understanding was the beginning of everything.